Clarence Cameron White. Clarence Cameron White was a very talented and accomplished black composer and concert violinist born in Clarksville, Tennessee, in the late 19th century. A time where orchestras and the music industry as a whole were predominantly white. White was considered the foremost black violinist of his time.
Here are a couple images of what Tennessee would have looked like in the early 1900s. Early life. He was born on August 10, 1880, to James W. White, who was a doctor and a principal, and Jeannie Scott White, a violinist at Oberlin Conservatory of Music.
Clarence's parents, specifically his mom, were very influential in Clarence's life. His father died when he was only 2 years old, leaving him, his mother and his younger brother to fend for themselves. The White family later relocated to Oberlin, Ohio to live with Mrs. White's parents. It was here that Clarence Cameron White was first introduced to the violin.
A recorded quote by Clarence White states that his mother took him to hear the Messiah sung at a conservatory and fell in love with the melody. His mother heard him humming it on the way home and noticed he had a good musical ear. Keep in mind Mrs. White was already an accomplished violinist. Mrs. White managed to convince 6-year-old Clarence's grandfather, who was a very religious man, to give Clarence his violin. Clarence's grandfather agreed to give Clarence the violin on the condition that he would never play secular music at a dance.
Clarence spent a lot of his life moving from place to place. As mentioned earlier, he was born in Clarksburg, Tennessee, but moved to Oberlin after the passing of his father. A couple years later, in 1890, Mrs. White remarried and the White family moved to Washington, D.C., where black communities were much more rooted and active in the music industry.
It was here that Clarence's interest in music really began to kick off. Clarence White stated that he recalled a time when his mother took him to a recital organized by Mrs. Alice Davis, who was the most renowned piano teacher in Washington at the time. He states that he was especially anxious and excited for the performance of Marion Cook, one of Mrs. Davis's students. The thing with these recitals, though, was that they lasted a very long time. At the time of Cook's number, Clarence was fast asleep. He states he remembered waking up to the sound of applause and bursting out crying to his mother that he had missed the performance. This wild expression of emotions caught the attention of old Cook, who after speaking with Mrs. White, decided to offer violin lessons to Clarence. Clarence was extremely grateful for this act of kindness from Mr. Cook and made it known. These lessons had a very big effect on Clarence, as he states that it was during this time that he made up his mind to be a violinist.
Education. If you hadn't noticed already, Clarence had a relatively comfortable life compared to those around him. He attended his private studies at Howard University with Joseph Douglas, who happened to be the grandson of abolitionist Frederick Douglass. As a side note, Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave who became a very prominent and powerful activist, author, and public speaker. Frederick Douglass was crucial and pivotal in the abolishment of slavery as a whole. After spending a couple years at Howard University, Clarence White was taught by Frederick Doolittle, Mr. Cook's former instructor, at the Oberlin Conservatory of Music. After another couple years, before graduating, Clarence dropped out to accept a teaching position in Pennsylvania. This only lasted a month. As mentioned before, he moved around a lot. He then won a scholarship to the Hartford School of Music. This lasted only a while, as Clarence took a chance to study abroad at a school in London. A couple years go by and he returns back to his city, before deciding to head off to Paris again.
It was through his line of work that Clarence found his wife, Beatrice. She was a very accomplished and recognized pianist in her time. They had 2 children, William White and Clarence White, Jr. Beatrice sadly passed away in October of 1942. White remarried a couple years later and lost to cancer on the 30th of June, 1960. By the time of his death, Clarence White had an endless list of accomplishments and milestones he reached. White had a busy, active career as a composer, teacher and performer. He served as the head of the string department of the Washington Conservatory of Music. He received lots of praise as a concert violinist and even went on tour a couple times across North America and Europe. He taught at many places including at West Virginia State College. During this time period he wrote some of his best-known works. Clarence White composed music in the modernist era, when the goal of composing music was to experiment and capture ideas.
Famous works. Although he produced music in the modernist era, a lot of Clarence White's work is classified as classical music. A lot of Clarence White's work was aesthetically similar to that of William Still, Florence Price, and Samuel Coleridge. Clarence drew a lot of inspiration for his themes and harmonic content from African American culture. He incorporated a lot of African American musical styles and traditions in his work. One of his pieces has been playing on repeat in the background of this video. Clarence White composed this song in 1927 for the piano and violin. Here's Levy Dance.
Another famous piece by Clarence White is Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen. This song was composed in 1918, and was also written for the piano and violin.
The end.